The Vietnam War, A Nation's War Within. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Struggle, 1887 to 1945. In the heart of Southeast Asia, where dense emerald canopies strangle the sky and rivers twist like coiled serpents through the land, a country was born from centuries of struggle. Vietnam, a name barely whispered in Western circles, stood as a thread in the fabric of colonial ambition. By 1887, the French had wrapped Indochina in silk and steel, their railways carved into ancestral soil, their cathedrals rose above rice paddies. But the spirit of Vietnam, ancient, indomitable, burned quietly beneath the surface, like coals beneath ash. A boy named Nguyen Sinh Kun was born in 1890 in the rural village of Hoang Tru. He was quiet, observant, and brilliant. As he aged, he became Nguyen Tut Thanh, and eventually Ho Chi Minh, a name that would echo through the jungles and into the annals of history. In Paris, Ho Chi Minh pleaded for self-determination at the Versailles Conference of 1919. He handed a letter to President Woodrow Wilson's aides. It was never answered. It would become one of the greatest silences in modern history. From that silence grew rage. Back home, secret societies formed in the shadows of temples. Books were burned, rebels disappeared. But a movement began. Communism wasn't ideology, it was salvation. By 1941, the world burned. The Japanese had invaded Vietnam under the guise of liberators. But all empires lie. Vietnam became the battleground of shadows. French colonizers, Japanese occupiers, and a growing resistance led by Ho Chi Minh in the remote caves of Pac Bo. He founded the Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalists and communists whose mission was simple: freedom at all costs. In 1945, the Japanese surrender. A power vacuum swells like a storm. And as the Allies celebrate the end of one war, Vietnam prepares for its beginning. Chapter 2. The Empire Returns. France's Last Stand, 1946 to 1954. In 1946, the smell of gunpowder returned to Vietnam. Though the Japanese were gone, France came rushing back, eager to reclaim what it believed was still its colonial jewel. But Vietnam had changed. Its people had tasted the breath of freedom, and they would not be chained again. France sent its legionnaires and elite paratroopers. Hanoi was seized. Viet Minh outposts were shelled. Villages burned. But Ho Chi Minh, ever the strategist, called it not war but resistance. He knew this battle would not be won in cities, but in the endless jungle, inch by bloody inch. Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher, became the sword of the revolution. He understood what no French general ever could. Vietnam was not terrain, it was people. So he moved like water. Guerrilla ambushes, booby traps made from bamboo, supply lines hidden beneath the earth. The French, accustomed to European warfare, drowned in the green hell. Then came Dien Bien Phu, the mountain fortress, the final gamble. France believed it was invincible. Encamped in a remote valley, surrounded by high ridges they assumed were unscalable. They were wrong. Giap's forces carried artillery piece by piece up the cliffs in silence, building firing positions in the mist. When the attack came, it was not thunder. It was a reckoning. 40 days of relentless siege turned trenches into graves. By May 1954, the French flag fell. Not just from Dien Bien Phu, but from all of Indochina. An empire crumbled in the mud. But freedom didn't come. At Geneva, the world's superpowers sat at polished tables and diced Vietnam like a cold carcass, and South split at the 17th parallel. No vote, no voice, just division. The French were gone, but in their place came the Americans. Chapter 3. Brothers Divided. The Birth of North and South, 1954 to 1963. Vietnam was free, but not whole. In Geneva, Western diplomats signed the lines that split a nation without ever setting foot in the rice paddies or knowing the names of the people they divided. The 17th parallel became an invisible wound. North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem. Two flags, two ideologies, one country bleeding in two. Ho ruled from Hanoi with iron and fire, a man of the people until the purges began. Landlords vanished. Dissenters were re-educated. The communist dream was a harsh reality. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic in a Buddhist land, ruled with American backing and quiet paranoia. He was hailed by Washington as the miracle man of Asia. But in Vietnam, he was feared. Corruption rotted his government. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, commanded secret police like a feudal warlord. Beneath the surface, another war was growing. The Viet Cong, shadow soldiers, sons of the South turned insurgents, began haunting the countryside. At night, they crept into villages, recruiting or killing. In daylight, they vanished into jungle and earth. They were ghosts in sandals. The U.S., convinced the dominoes were about to fall, sent money, advisors, and weapons. Diem's army, the ARVN, paraded in neat formations, but collapsed under ambushes. American generals smiled in press photos, but in the shadows, CIA operatives whispered of instability. Then, in 1963, the unthinkable happened. A Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat calmly at a Saigon intersection, doused himself in gasoline, and struck a match. His body burned, but he did not scream. The world watched in stunned silence. America could no longer ignore the fire in South Vietnam. In November, a CIA-backed coup struck. Diem and his brother were hunted down and assassinated in the back of an armored car. Vietnam had no leader, only chaos. Chapter 4: The American War, Rolling Thunder, 1964 to 1968. Vietnam's storm was now America's war. In August 1964, under the black waves of the Gulf of Tonkin, something happened. A clash between U.S. destroyers and North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Or so the story went. The facts were murky, the fog of war thick, but it was all Washington needed. Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and with that, the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, was handed a blank check for war. Operation Rolling Thunder began. For 3 years, U.S. aircraft pounded the north. Hanoi, Haiphong, jungles, bridges, supply routes. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became a permanent target. Over 7 million tons of bombs fell, more than in all of World War II combined. But the Vietnamese did not break. Instead, they dug deeper. Entire cities moved underground. Hospitals, classrooms, even theaters were built in the dark. Children grew up beneath the earth, learning math by candlelight as bombs shook the world above. Back in the South, American boots hit the ground, first as advisors, then as soldiers, hundreds of thousands. Marines in Da Nang, air cavalry in the highlands, special forces in the delta. But this was no traditional battlefield. The enemy wore no uniform. They struck and disappeared. A rice farmer by day, a guerrilla by night, villages were riddled with suspicion. Every jungle path could be a trap, every child a potential scout. And so, U.S. tactics hardened. Napalm seared the landscape, burning skin from bone. Agent Orange poisoned the trees and the generations to come. Search and destroy missions tore through hamlets. American soldiers, young and terrified, saw the world not in black and white, but in blood and shadow. The Tet Offensive loomed. But first, the world began to change. Back home, television screens in Kansas and California flickered with images of burning villages and broken soldiers. Body bags came home by the thousands. Victory seemed further with every step. And yet the brass kept saying, "We are winning." Then came 1968. Chapter 5. Tet, the turning point, 1968. It was the year of the monkey. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. A time of peace, of prayers, of families reuniting with incense and offerings. In both North and South, even among soldiers, an informal ceasefire was expected. Then came the explosions. At dawn on January 30th, 1968, over 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers launched a coordinated assault across more than 100 cities and towns. From the Mekong Delta to the ancient capital of Hue, even to the very heart of Saigon. Mortar fire hit the U.S. Embassy compound. America watched in disbelief. The attack was massive, unexpected, and brilliantly timed. The enemy emerged from tunnels, rice paddies, and alleys, striking police stations, barracks, and government buildings. In Hue, one of Vietnam's most sacred cities, it became a house-to-house war. Whole neighborhoods turned into bloody mazes. The Perfume River ran red. For nearly a month, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese forces battled block by block. Hue would never be the same. The Viet Cong didn't hold their gains long. Militarily, the offensive was a failure. Tens of thousands were killed, entire units wiped out. But psychologically, Tet was devastating for America. Because Washington had promised victory was near. And yet here were enemy troops breaching the gates of the U.S. Embassy. On live television, the illusion shattered. News anchors no longer read Pentagon briefings. They questioned them. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, stood before the cameras and said what millions feared. We are mired in stalemate. Public support collapsed. Protests surged in every major U.S. city. Lyndon Johnson, worn and haunted, announced he would not seek re-election. Vietnam had broken the American spirit, not through victory, but through persistence. The war was not over, but something vital had changed. Chapter 6, Hearts and Minds, The War at Home, 1968 to 1972. By 1968, the Vietnam War was no longer just fought in the paddies and jungles of Southeast Asia. It had spilled into American living rooms, into college campuses, into hearts and minds. Television, for the first time in history, made war personal. Every night, Families gathered for dinner as black and white screens flashed images of body bags, burning villages, weeping children. The contrast was unbearable. The official words said progress, but the images screamed catastrophe. Across the United States, students challenged the war. They marched, they sang, they chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" From Berkeley to Boston, Columbia to Kent State, universities became battlegrounds of their own. In 1970, on a cold May day in Ohio, the war came home with a bullet. 4 students lay dead at Kent State, shot by the National Guard during a protest. One carried only books. Another was simply walking to class. The nation gasped. It wasn't just hippies and radicals now. It was everyone's child. Even veterans returned broken and confused. They had fought in hellish jungles, seen unspeakable things, lost friends, and now returned to jeers, not thanks. America, once so sure of itself, was unraveling. And yet, the war raged on. Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969 with a promise: peace with honor. But behind the curtain, a new strategy emerged: Vietnamization. The goal: reduce U.S. troop presence and shift the fighting to the South Vietnamese army. But in secret, Nixon widened the war, bombing Cambodia and Laos, nations never formally in the conflict. The Pentagon called it strategic, the press called it illegal, and trust finally collapsed. Then came the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst, they revealed what many suspected. The government had known the war was unwinnable for years. Lies, layered upon lies, and the public had had enough. The war had become a mirror, and America no longer liked what it saw. Chapter 7, Exit Wounds, The Fall of Saigon, 1973 to 1975. By 1973, American combat troops had left Vietnam. Not in triumph, not in peace, but in exhaustion. The Paris Peace Accords, signed that January, promised an end. Ceasefire, prisoner exchanges, U.S. withdrawal. A quiet hope fluttered through the air, but it was a mirage. North Vietnamese forces never stopped moving. In the shadows, they rebuilt. The Viet Cong remained embedded, elusive. And South Vietnam, without American military might at its side, began to fray. President Nixon, cornered by the Watergate scandal, soon resigned. His promise of peace with honor evaporated with him. The U.S. public, weary and betrayed, had no more will to return. And so, when North Vietnamese tanks began their final push in early 1975, there was no cavalry, only silence. By April, the North had surrounded Saigon. The world watched on television as a city braced for impact. South Vietnamese civilians, interpreters, teachers, officials, those who had trusted America, flooded the U.S. Embassy. They carried children, photo albums, bags stuffed with hope, but the planes were few, the gates locked. Then came Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. From the rooftops of Saigon, choppers lifted off, one by one, under fire, whisking away diplomats, Marines, and terrified Vietnamese. One image became iconic: desperate souls climbing a staircase to a rooftop, reaching toward a hovering Huey. It was not the embassy, but a CIA safe house. But that didn't matter. The world saw abandonment. At dawn on April 30th, 1975, the North Vietnamese Tank 390 crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Saigon fell. The war was over. The victors called it liberation. The defeated called it betrayal. The Americans called it a wound. A war that cost over 58,000 U.S. lives. Millions of Vietnamese lives, countless more broken in body and spirit. And for the first time in its history, America had lost a war, not from lack of firepower, but from something far deeper, a conflict without purpose. A lie repeated too long, a war fought in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons, with the wrong promises. And those left behind would never forget. Chapter 8, Aftershocks, The Vietnam Syndrome and American Memory, 1975 to 1985. Vietnam was over, but America was far from healed. The end didn't come with a clean cut. It came like a tremor, rippling through the nation's soul, through the halls of power, through living rooms lined with folded flags, through a generation of veterans who returned not to cheers, but to silence. They came home to find themselves strangers, jobs gone, marriages strained, memories that clawed at them in the night. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was barely understood, even by doctors. Veterans were dismissed as unstable. Many turned to drugs, to alcohol, to the streets. The war had not just taken years, it had taken identities. In Washington, the political elite recoiled. Vietnam had become a dirty word. A new term entered the national vocabulary: the Vietnam Syndrome. It described the paralyzing fear of becoming entangled in another unwinnable foreign war. The ghosts of Saigon haunted every debate, every intelligence briefing, every military intervention that never happened. And yet beneath the surface, rage brewed. Some blamed the press, others blamed the protesters, many blamed the politicians. Books poured onto shelves, memoirs, conspiracies, betrayals. Hollywood followed, turning pain into cinema. The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Platoon. Films didn't glorify the war. They interrogated it, shattered it, made it human. Still, the veterans waited for something more. A monument, a gesture. Then, in 1982, after years of controversy, a new memorial rose in Washington, D.C. Not a statue of heroism, but a wall. Black granite, carved with 58,318 names. No flags, no judgment, just names. And as veterans approached it, many for the first time, they cried. Not just for the dead, but because finally, someone had remembered. In the reflection of that wall, America saw not just its fallen, but itself. And though the war was over, the question still lingered. What was it all for? Chapter 9, The Shadow of Defeat. How Vietnam Changed American Foreign Policy, 1985 to 2000. The war in Vietnam was over, but its ghost haunted every war that came after. From the White House Situation Room to the Pentagon's wargaming tables, a single question echoed. How do we never lose like that again? The U.S. had emerged from Vietnam not just scarred, but uncertain. Once the world's unstoppable military force, now it hesitated. Presidents now measured every foreign conflict against a shadow, the Vietnam Syndrome. In 1983, that caution was shattered. A bomb detonated at the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, killing 241 American servicemen. The world saw it as weakness. But President Reagan saw it differently. He didn't double down, he withdrew. And in that moment, Vietnam's reach stretched across continents. But Reagan wouldn't make that mistake again. Later that same year, in a lightning-fast days-long operation, the U.S. invaded Grenada. There were Marines, paratroopers, naval gunfire, but most importantly, victory. Short, sharp, clean. America cheered. The Vietnam Syndrome, some said it was broken, yet deep down the shadow still loomed. Then came Panama in 1989. Another short campaign. Then the moment that would define a generation, the Gulf War. Iraq had invaded Kuwait, Saddam Hussein was defiant, and President George H.W. Bush had one mission: restore American might without repeating the sins of Vietnam. This time, it would be different. Massive coalitions. Clear objectives, limited scope, overwhelming firepower, a war made for television. Operation Desert Storm opened with a bombing campaign that lit up Baghdad like a video game. Smart bombs, night vision, laser-guided strikes. Then the ground war began. 100 hours later, it was over. Iraq was expelled. American forces were triumphant. And for the first time in decades, the United States believed in its military again. Bush declared, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all." But had they? Iraq's dictator remained. The Middle East simmered. And behind the applause, a new kind of war was already gestating. One with no borders, no uniforms, no treaties. It would take one more national tragedy to finally bury the shadow of Vietnam. But for now, in the golden haze of victory, America stood tall once again. Chapter 10, The Unfinished War, Vietnam's Lessons in the Age of Terror, 2001 to 2021. On the morning of September 11, 2001, America woke to a nightmare. Jetliners hijacked, turned into weapons. The Pentagon, burning. The Twin Towers, gone. The Vietnam War was no longer the ghost haunting America's past. It was the blueprint for what to, but the echoes were there. The enemy wasn't a uniformed army. There were no front lines, no surrendering generals, just shadows. And once again, America went to war. Afghanistan was first. The mission? Destroy the Taliban, crush Al-Qaeda, kill Osama bin Laden. This wouldn't be another Vietnam, they promised. This would be fast, righteous, surgical. But Afghanistan wasn't Saigon. It was something far more elusive. Endless mountain ranges, ancient tribal lands, a society that had swallowed empires from Alexander to the Soviets. Weeks turned to months, months turned to years. And then, Iraq. In 2003, citing weapons of mass destruction and links to terror, the U.S. launched a second war. The regime fell quickly. Saddam was captured, but the aftermath spiraled. Insurgencies, car bombings, IEDs, sectarian chaos. Vietnam's ghost whispered again. Don't confuse victory with peace. Journalists embedded with troops, the war streamed in real time. Body cameras, drones, night raids. But the script had flipped. This time the soldiers were praised, but they were also weary. By 2010, Americans had spent nearly a decade at war. Children born after 9/11 were watching YouTube clips of a war that still wasn't over. The parallels to Vietnam deepened. Unclear goals, unfamiliar terrain, inconsistent allies. Only now it wasn't the jungles of Indochina. It was the deserts of Fallujah, the valleys of Helmand, the villages of Kandahar. And once again, the politicians changed. The mission shifted. The public grew exhausted. Then in 2021, after 20 years of blood and promises, American troops withdrew from Afghanistan. As helicopters lifted off from Kabul, desperate civilians clung to landing gear. The world watched. And once again, America remembered Saigon. 2 wars, trillions spent, thousands of lives lost. And the same bitter question returned. Did we win? Vietnam had become more than a war. It was a mirror. And 2 decades later, America was still staring into its reflection. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Superpower: How Vietnam Shapes Modern American Global Dominance, 2022 to Present and Beyond. August 30th, 2021. The last American plane left Kabul, and with it, 20 years of war ended. But did it? Because Vietnam didn't just end in 1975, and Afghanistan didn't end in 2021. The legacy of both still pulses beneath the surface of American power. You see, empires aren't just built on territory. They're built on memory, narrative, lessons learned or ignored. And modern American dominance, the tech, the diplomacy, the sanctions, the culture, is shaped more by what was lost than what was won. Vietnam taught America not to trust wars without exits. Iraq and Afghanistan taught her that exits come at a price. So today, the battlefield has changed. Not soldiers and rifles, but chips and drones. Cyber attacks, sanctions, espionage. The empire adapted. Washington now uses economic warfare the way it once used napalm. The Treasury is a more powerful weapon than the Pentagon. Look at Russia. In 2022, when Moscow invaded Ukraine, it wasn't boots on the ground America sent, but billions in weapons. Intel, drones, sanctions that froze oligarchs and destabilized currencies. This was Vietnam in reverse. America learned not to bleed for others, but to make others bleed for their own cause. In Taiwan and the South China Sea, in cyberspace, America projects strength, but with gloves on, always watching, always calculating. Even Hollywood is a weapon. Netflix, TikTok, YouTube, cultural dominance. And behind it all, the specter of Vietnam. Because now every future war will be judged by the ghost of that jungle. And no president, Democrat or Republican, will forget how fast public support can vanish when wars feel like quicksand. But the world is watching too. From Beijing to Tehran, they study Vietnam as closely as Washington once did. Because empires fall not from enemies, but from the rot within. And for America, Vietnam is not a scar, it's a warning label. A label etched on every carrier group, every treaty, every drone strike. Beware the war with no end. And yet, the machine hums on. Because empires don't retire, they evolve. And America, she may be bruised, but she is still standing.